We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, Culture Editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Christopher Rufo, writer, filmmaker, and director of the Discovery Institute's Center on Wealth and Poverty. Chris, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's great to be with you.
I actually want to start by reading from a tweet that you posted in September. And this is not me digging up tweets to cancel you. This is actually a tweet that I found very compelling. I found it in my inbox. Somebody had sent it around. But you tweeted, a senior scientist sent me a message last night saying that his government laboratory has become an activist hive attempting to ram far left-wing propaganda down our throats, with managers purging conservative researchers. I'm fighting for this man and millions like him. I wanted to start with that tweet because I do think it describes the work that you do very well. And I was hoping you could just sort of explain for some of our listeners who might not be familiar with it. If they're on Twitter, they're probably very familiar with it. But if you could sort of explain for our listeners what exactly it is right now that you are working to combat and how you're doing it.
Yeah, well, that tweet, came on the heels of President Trump's executive order banning critical race theory programs. So programs that traffic in racial stereotypes and race essentialism and kind of race-based harassment. I did a series of investigative reports last summer showing the kind of pervasiveness of these programs in the federal government. Trump got rid of them to the delight of so many employees. And one of the cool things was I got a series of these messages from scientists and poets and academics and school leaders and people working in universities from all walks of life, all different kinds of professions, saying, thank you for standing up for us against these harmful and divisive programs. So I'm still fighting on this. President Biden, on his first day in office, actually rescinded that executive order. So we're adopting some new strategies, but the goal is really simple. Take this ideology, critical race theory, that has become really dominant in American institutions, and try to find ways to push back and make sure that we are fighting for equality and not equity, which is something that sounds very similar, but is quite different in reality.
All right, let's dig into that right now because it's a super hot topic with the, even just today, President Biden gave remarks on equity. We heard from Jen Psaki some stuff about that before President Biden delivered his remarks. So what is the explanation, or how do you compare equity and equality? Because I think it's such an innocuous, or it seems to be such a small distinction that it probably doesn't register with most people. It probably sounds as though the Biden administration is pursuing a whole bunch of policies that are designed to bring about equality. But that's very different than equity, and that's very different from what they mean when they say equity. So can you kind of explain the distinction there?
Yeah, the difference between equality and equity is the same as the difference between justice and social justice. And the idea is to use the cachet of those terms, justice, equality, freedom, things that are resonating from American history, but to change them grammatically, kind of as far as the actual language slightly, but philosophically in massive ways. So equality, as we practice it in the United States since the 14th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act, it's been a move towards treating people on the kind of individual basis equally, regardless of their inborn characteristics or traits. So not discriminating against people on the basis of race, sex, etc. Religion in this case as well. And the idea, again, is kind of protecting individual rights and not infringing upon those. Equity is something different. It's not a protection of individual rights. The philosophy of equity actually rejects the idea of individual rights and saying individual rights, as they're practiced in the Constitution and the law, are actually a smokescreen for racial domination. And to get to true equality, you actually need equity, which is dividing people along the basis of race into groups and then using the power of the state to, in some cases, forcibly equalize the scales, equalize the outcomes between various group identities. So very different. It goes from a kind of individual rights basis, which is the foundation of our law, to a group rights basis, which is something we're seeing really for the first time, and frankly, unfortunately, has tremendous negative consequences.
Yeah, and I want to kind of get what you think some of those negative consequences are, because again, this is something that was percolating on college campuses and in academia for decades, and it was sort of dismissed as the predictable radicalism of academia by so many people, and that's really how it started to snowball. And it's how it sort of hit critical mass in the cultural institutions outside of academia, the newsrooms, the boardrooms, the writers' rooms of Hollywood. And so, in terms of the negative consequences, I imagine you've confronted a lot of them in your work through tips that you get, through requests for help that people pass along, and information about various workplaces around the country. What, in your experience, do these negative consequences actually look like?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of operates on a couple different levels, but on the individual basis, I've had hundreds of reports from people who say, "Hey, I'm a public school teacher, for example. I got into education because I love kids. Now I'm being forced to undergo hours upon hours of training, where because of my skin color, or because of my sexual orientation, or because of my religion, I'm made to feel like I bear the guilt and burdens of all the sins in history." And they're trying to ask me to denounce my identity, to denounce my race, to denounce my religion, and publicly confess the sin of being born for who I am. And it's psychologically crushing. It's tremendously damaging to a lot of people who also feel powerless to stand up to it, because they're worried about getting fired, they're worried about getting ridiculed, they're worried about getting slandered by their colleagues or in the press. And so we have this kind of individual problem, which I think is important and real, but more broadly, we have a kind of society-wide problem where moving away from equality towards equity, moving away from justice towards social justice, we're creating a system of policy and practice that is antithetical to our Constitution, antithetical to the Bill of Rights, antithetical to American law. And the idea on the top line is just social justice. But really, if you kind of peel back the layers of ideology and you get to the core of this belief system, they're advocating for, in essence, a kind of cultural revolution steeped in Marxism, adjusted to identity politics, and now activated through Black Lives Matter, through critical race theory, and absurdly through even corporate HR departments. And that could have, in the medium and long term, very negative and even kind of devastating social consequences.
One of the most difficult questions, I think, to understand is how widespread cancel culture actually is. And cancel culture is very heavily predicated and driven by the social justice movement that you study and that you follow very closely. So as somebody who's in touch with people around the country who are dealing with these issues, and the stories we hear about are like what happened to Barry Weiss. We hear so often about these media figures who face however we define cancel culture, but they're the ones that are empowered to actually start a Substack. They're the ones that have the resources to tackle this head on or to make something of it. But there are a lot of people around the country who lack that sort of influence and lack the resources to fight back. So they either stay quiet or they face some consequences. What have you heard, and what is your sense of, how widespread this actually is? I know you actually have a report up on your site right now. I think you published it in City Journal about a public school in Missouri. And I can only imagine, if you could tell us a little bit about that story, I can only imagine being a parent in that school district and thinking about how to oppose the curriculum that's sort of being shoved down young students' throats. Is this something that's isolated to coastal newsrooms, or is this something that's really now infiltrated a huge section of the country?
Yeah, it absolutely has. And I think you're exactly right to make the distinction. For people in media or politics, cancel culture is something that can be devastating. It also can be kind of jujitsued into a new platform or reaching a new audience. And I think that is good, right? It's one way to combat cancel culture is to turn the cancellation into a potential benefit, right? Into kind of using it to create more awareness or audience. But people that are in the kind of working and middle classes don't have the opportunity to turn a cancellation into some kind of jujitsu maneuver. Actually, it could be quite devastating to people. And, I have, even on my word processor right now, I'm working on another story from a local school district, and a veteran teacher says, and these are direct quotes, I almost feel like we're walking around on eggshells. You have to be careful what you say. I'm afraid of speaking up for fear I might lose my job. And this is because of relentless critical race theory programs, diversity programs, trafficking and racial stereotypes. And she says, again, a quote, I don't want to go back to work. I don't believe in this. It goes against my faith system. It's downright wrong. We're all created as equals in God's sight, and this is just wrong the way we're teaching our children. I don't have to be embarrassed because of my skin color. And this is just one small quote that you have to replicate millions of times throughout our society, because people are confronting this. I hear from hundreds of them on a weekly basis, which goes to show, I think, that there are many, many more that have yet to be uncovered.
Yeah, that's it's you're somebody who would actually kind of know how widespread this is, because it's hard to do any sort of quantitative measurement, because so much of it is just the chilling effect of what you're getting from your human resources department, or what you're learning about your students' curriculum, or what's being said at the PTA meeting, et cetera, et cetera. Is that sort of a correct understanding of how this is playing out, that it's not only people who do find the courage, or which is not an easy thing to do, and I don't judge anybody who doesn't, but it's not just the people who face consequences for speaking out. Is it also that there's this widespread chilling effect where if you are a Christian parent that opposes the public school curriculum, it's not as easy as it might have been in the past to raise that issue with administrators or the principal or whomever, because then your reputation is on the line. And so I imagine it's also just kind of the chilling effect that, a lot of these documents that are passed along and this curriculum that's passed along have on people around the country.
Yeah, and I think it's deliberate. I think that it's more than a chilling effect. It's a kind of cultural intimidation, and that's the technique that people are using. And frankly, it works. I mean, people tell me all the time, I can't say anything because of X, Y, and Z, or this is happening at work, or this is happening in my kid's school, and and people feel terrified. I saw an interesting quote that stuck with me, that from a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, and he had gone to China to work with tech companies there, and then came back to San Francisco and said, wrote something to the effect that I was shocked. I kind of realized in a moment that people feel more able to freely speak their mind in China than they do in San Francisco. And it's not because we have a kind of repressive censorship state like the Chinese Communist Party operates, although we seem to be kind of slightly edging in that general direction. It's because we have a kind of culture of self-censorship and a kind of wall of fear that is maintained by the kind of arbiters of cancel culture in order to shut up the opposition. And this is undoubtedly true. And I always find it amazing that there are some kind of center-left commentators that deny the existence of cancel culture, and then in a kind of delicious irony, I know that 2 of them have actually been canceled in the last week, who had previously denied that it even existed. So, I mean, we're reaching the levels of kind of absurdity and denial and dark humor that can't maintain for much longer. People are going to have to finally start speaking the truth.
Yeah, and one of the complaints, or I'm sort of focusing on the center left critics that remarkably will still deny the existence of cancel culture. One of their critiques is that, both sides use it, and the right really loves cancel culture at the end of the day. And admittedly, of course, there are always people who are, enjoy the bloodlust of politics more than the sort of ideology and the moral purpose of it. But what is the distinction between the people on the right who might at times dabble in cancel culture and what we see coming from the left? Because to me, it seems very obvious that this is coming from the cultural institutions that are now totally under the sway of cultural leftists, and the right doesn't really exert the force of any institutions that it might still have a kind of grip on in the same way, from my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a simple kind of heuristic test, right, where you can answer this question really definitively. Let's say you are sitting in the offices of the Treasury Department or Google, or a school board meeting in, suburban Bay Area. Which of the following statements would you feel uncomfortable sharing? And then go through kind of some left positions and then some right positions. I am a conservative Christian who believes in X, Y, and Z, or I am a radical, vegetarian atheist who believes that the police should be abolished. And I mean, clearly the left positions are far more comfortable. They're far less risky. And you look at the kind of media messaging, right? I mean, even corporations are using the language and rhetoric and imagery of social justice and Black Lives Matter in order to sell products, in order to put out their message. They're not using any of the kind of language or imagery from the right. So I think that, someone who believes that cancel culture on the left and right are equal and opposite forces, they're being dishonest, in which case you should disregard their opinion, or they're just so kind of checked out of reality that you should discard their opinion with even more certainty.
A lot of people, I think, especially in the summer months, were left kind of reeling and wondering where it all went wrong. Why are there mobs roving our cities and tearing down statues of people that, let's say, fought for the Union and were abolitionists? If you pay really close attention to what happens on college campuses, it's really that wouldn't have been particularly surprising, although the sort of rapidity at which it became mainstream dogma was surprising. But where did we go wrong? What is your answer to people who are still sort of reeling and their heads are spinning from the culture and the country that they thought they knew to what they watched transpire in 2020, what they're seeing, for instance, out of the very civil and unifying and bipartisan White House right now? What is your best sort of explanation for how we got to this point?
I think that what the left did, frankly, very brilliantly and very successfully, is that they deployed a kind of premise and conclusion framework in politics and in media that I think the right was unequipped to push back against. And specifically, the premise was the death of George Floyd. And I think we can all agree it's a tragic death. I don't think there's anyone who believes otherwise. But what they did with that kind of single tragic death, I don't think there's a kind of larger systemic, the statistics don't support a kind of larger systemic reading of this. But they took that emotional anchor, that's how I like to think of it. They made that the premise. So then saying, okay, this is the emotional anchor, this is the premise. The conclusion is rioting in the streets, Black Lives Matter, equity departments, Kamala Harris, all of these kind of follow-ons. And what they did brilliantly was that they created a premise that people, including people on the right, were too scared to argue against and too scared to oppose. Because then they could say, well, you just think that George Floyd getting killed was good, or you're a white supremacist, or whatever. All of the kind of insults and kind of scary words that they wield. But we should have basically said, okay, what is the true nature of the premise? Let's be really critically thinking about this. Take the heat, take the blowback for that. Can it extrapolate into larger systemic forces? Do these conclusions follow from the premise? Are they logically connected? And then essentially deny not the facts of the emotional premise, but deny the kind of false conclusions from that premise. But instead, conservatives just kind of went into panic, went into hiding, retreated, kind of from politics for a bit, and let these things really just go crazy. And I think we have to be much more courageous and much stronger in how we dissect the arguments of the left, how we can separate out a kind of emotional premise from a factual premise, and then how we can sever the connection between premise and conclusion.
Yeah, and that's really similar to what listeners might have heard me talk about in the past, which is what I've called the progressive or bigot binary. And it's not this like strategic Alinskyite formulation. It's just how it's like the logical conclusion of their silly ideology, which is that you are either fully progressive or you are necessarily a bigot, and anybody who departs from that dogma briefly, be they J.K. Rowling or Barry Weiss, is necessarily a bigot and must be treated as such, and must be treated essentially in the same way that one would treat David Duke. And I completely agree that, there has to be more strength and backbone, not just among conservatives, but people on the center and the center left to, as somebody who may have signed the Harper's letter or may sympathize with one of the sort of centrists who signed the Harper's letter. But what does that look like for conservatives? How does somebody, let's take somebody that may have a student at that Missouri middle school that you wrote about. What should they do? How can people start pushing back on this practically, and then maybe more broadly from a political perspective, here in Washington?
Yeah, I mean, first off, if this is happening within your local institutions, you can really effectively fight back. One is leak it to the press. If your kind of mainstream local press won't take it, go to conservative talk radio in your city, go to other conservative outlets, so people who are politically aligned. Raise the alarm, expose it to the light, and then band together with other parents. If you can get a half a dozen families to oppose something happening in a school, they will have to listen to you. You will be a force to be reckoned with, and you can actually get things done. I've reported on a case where this exact thing happened. There was these race theory programs that were separating 8-year-olds into oppressor and oppressed. Some parents got together and they said, enough of this, and they kind of stamped it out. And, more broadly on the kind of politically, we need leaders who have courage and strength. We need leaders who are willing to lay down the marker on some of these cultural issues, because we have, I think, in many cases, a kind of establishment, conservative class that is fighting the last war. They're fighting against socialism and centralization and the Soviet Union. But that's not the world we live in. Yeah, deregulation and taxes and all those things are important, but we've essentially won that fight. And the left has responded not through economic revolution, but through not through economic and political revolution, rather, but through a cultural revolution. This is explicit. You read their literature; they're not hiding it. It's been kind of the dominant strategy since 1968, and we have to get more sophisticated fighting it. And the first step is having the courage to get the mud thrown at you and to stand tall and stand strong and not apologize, and actually to draw a clear moral line. And you can basically say, this is right, this is wrong, this is why we oppose it, and not letting the kind of blowback, damage your sense of self, damage your sense of confidence.
Yeah, and another question I have is, do you think that the appetite for pushback on this, it's one thing to say, a broad spectrum of Americans and voters oppose what is sort of commonly understood as cancel culture and oppose some of this like very radical literature that is often circulated from human resources departments or from in the classroom, whatever it is. But then it's another thing to say that people actually want to see politicians fight those measures. They actually want to see politicians or thought leaders or whomever it is, fight back. And so what is your instinct? What is your read on the public, since you actually, are frequently in contact with people around the country that are coming into contact with these problems? Do you think that this is, goes beyond the Republican base, this appetite to fight what we kind of understand as cancel culture?
Yeah, I think it does. I think that the kind of cultural revolution is how I think about the kind of broader campaign. Cancel culture is merely one tactic within that framework. And I think in the media, we kind of focus on cancel culture because it's like the ultimate fear of media personalities. People who are public and engaged don't want to lose their platforms. I mean, I don't, no one does. But I think that we need to take a step back and actually look through the kind of eyes of of kind of working and middle class people in suburbs and exurbs and cities, and actually say, hey, what is important? What are the institutions that are supremely important to these people in their daily lives? What are they turning into that they don't like or don't even know about? And how can you both educate the public on those issues and then also kind of agitate against those new structures and new orthodoxies? And that's going to take intellectual leadership. It's going to take think tank leadership. It's going to take political leadership. And I think right now, when Joe Biden is doubling down on race theory, on equity, on all of these programs, Republican state legislators need to basically create a countervailing policy at the state level to say, we're not going to allow people to traffic racial stereotypes. We're not going to allow people to traffic race-based collective guilt. We're not going to allow people to perpetuate critical race theory in the curriculum. And they need to make a kind of clear distinction. Do you want this or do you want that? When you create that contrast, I think most people on the right, the center, and even the center left will join our camp.
Well, let's zoom in on critical race theory quickly, because that's sort of what is the broad category that so much of this falls under. The Missouri school that you reported on recently had an oppression matrix, I think, that they were passing out to preteens or adolescents, young students, basically. And how is, if you could just sort of briefly define critical race theory and then explain how it manifests through a lot of these channels that are impacting, working people around the country and our culture.
Yeah, I mean, critical race theory it's kind of a funny term in the sense that it was a academic subdiscipline originally in law schools in the 1990s, and then became a kind of broader category for taking critical studies, which was based on critical theory, which was based on kind of neo-Marxism of the Frankfurt School. And then it became this all-encompassing way of thinking about race. So there's critical race pedagogy, critical race, critical facts, all of these kind of intersecting theories that share a kind of common lineage or common root structure. And I think, though, critical race theory has become, I think, to our kind of benefit, and also because of our good work on this, critical race theory has become the new label that we've created that we can subsume all of these other things under, where we say, hey, critical race theory means X, Y, and Z. It includes X, Y, and Z programs, policies, attitudes, ideologies, etc. And we can now have a kind of clear target to fight against. And I think that for people who are just kind of tuning into this, critical race theory is essentially the idea that in the United States that America is a fundamentally and irredeemably racist country, and that all of our institutions since the founding up until the present day, these are political institutions, social institutions, economic institutions, even though they preach equality and liberty, are actually smokescreens for a kind of naked racial oppression. And that racism in 2021 is no better than racism in 1621. It's just changed forms. That's the basic philosophy, and I think that kind of any basic reading of facts or history would really call it into question.
And what's amazing about that is it's not being peddled by fringe academics, in ivory towers. It's actually now coming from people like, at the New York Times and in these super mainstream cultural institutions with massive platforms. So I'm curious as to what is the intellectual well from which this has sprung? Where do you sort of say the roots of this intellectually are? Is it in moral relativism? Is it in, post-structuralism? Those are obviously connected. But what is the sort of intellectual source of this particular strain of cultural leftism that we now find ourselves sort of governed by?
Yeah, I mean, people on the left, their heads absolutely explode if you use the phrase cultural Marxism. But as I've studied it, as I've talked to people, as I've reviewed the literature, I think that's probably the best kind of single phrase to describe the overall lineage. Again, it's only two words. It's not going to explain everything. It's not going to explain nuance, but I think it's a good kind of catch-all categorization. And it's something that is not new either. People have been talking about cultural Marxism since the 1970s in that exact phrasing. And I think it's basically this. They're taking oppressor and oppressed, the kind of Marxist dichotomy between bourgeoisie and proletariat. And then in the 60s, they reformulated it because their economic revolution had failed in Russia and in Asia and in other places around the world. So they said, all right, we need to reformulate because kind of economic Marxism will never penetrate Europe, will definitely never penetrate the United States that has a large middle class. So let's replace economic categories of bourgeoisie and proletariat with racial categories of black and white or minority and white. This is something that generates a tremendous amount of emotional power and would be a better rallying point for our revolution than the old categories. And that was basically the work of Marxist intellectuals in the 1960s. We saw it in everything from kind of the Frankfurt School and Marcuse, all the way to kind of reformulating pedagogy and education with Paulo Freire in Brazil, and then his ideas kind of perpetuating through the West. It's all, in my view, having really kind of studied into it, it's all kind of a rehash of the ideas from the late 1960s that lay dormant for a little while, and now they're back with a vengeance.
Would you say, what are the channels that you see this sort of coming through the most? In other words, like we've talked about human resources departments, we've talked about curriculum, but where do you think like most of this, where should people be looking for this to sort of come from, maybe in their own daily lives?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, and this is kind of staggering and sad to say, but they should basically look at every institution in which they participate. I mean, it's in your elementary school, potentially. It's in your church, potentially. It's in your city government, potentially. Maybe not even potentially anymore, depending on where you live. It's probably more of a probably. People should really keep an eye out and push back. And some of the kind of key words that sound nice and in a lot of times mask something much more sinister are equity, diversity, inclusion, cultural competency, whatever. There's a whole kind of rotating list of euphemisms, and people should keep their eyes open, their ears open, and be ready to push back.
What's the harm in not pushing back? Let's wrap up on this point, because you mentioned earlier that if we aren't sort of due for a course correction and we don't make that course correction, there could be devastating negative social consequences. So if your human resources department is telling you how to not be transphobic with preferred pronouns, or how to be an ally to your Black coworkers and your Hispanic coworkers, by reading this literature, accepting this literature, and doing X, Y, and Z, what's the harm in not doing that? And then, what could that, let's say that, there is harm. What can we see coming down the pipeline for the country in 5 years if the course correction doesn't happen?
So I think those small items, right, the pronouns or the kind of race-based apologies or what have you, those are what I think of as a sales technique called the first yes. And in a sales, you want to get someone to say yes to anything. Oh, hey, can you sit down for lunch? Do you have a minute? Hey, how's your day going? You want people to basically make a first kind of micro agreement, because if you make that small agreement, you're more likely then to be able to pitch that person and make the big sale. And the big sale is really what we're looking at here. And you don't have to take what that world would look like from me. You can just read a piece by Ibram X. Kendi in Politico, where he advocates for a new fourth branch of government called the Department of Anti-Racism that is not accountable to Congress, not accountable to the president, is unelected, staffed by hand-picked anti-racist bureaucrats. And this Department of Anti-Racism, under the kind of, in Kendi's kind of imagination, would be have the power to regulate all political speech and ensure that all speech from policymakers, which undoubtedly would include think tanks and journalists and other people working in politics, it would have to be anti-racist, and it would have kind of plenary or omnipotent power to stop and shut down any political speech that is not anti-racist. In addition, it would have the power to nullify or void any law at any level of government, whether it's local, state, federal, to nullify any law that is not anti-racist or creating racially disproportionate outcomes. So this would essentially be a kind of new regime. It would be an overthrow of the Constitution, an overthrow of balance of powers, overthrow of property rights, overthrow of individual rights, overthrow of freedom of speech. And this is written in the pages of Politico and another one in the pages of the Washington Post. And this is a totalitarian nightmare. There's no other way to describe it. There's no other way to kind of honestly read it. And the thing that just absolutely blows my mind is that Ibram Kendi is not kind of ridiculed or criticized or condemned for this. He's lauded and celebrated and lavished with corporate cash from Twitter and other major companies. And we seem to think because of that emotional anchor, right? That kind of first sale, that anything goes. And this is totally acceptable policy proposal for American life.
Yeah, it's like the process of normalization. I love that sort of first sale. It kind of snowballs from there. And just my last question, that's sort of a perfect segue. My last question is, given that books like Kendi's have basically been runaway massive bestsellers, and there are others that were bestsellers over the summer, and there have been, this is something that's not just in the pages of Politico, but also now being wrapped into sitcoms and all of our sort of cultural institutions. Are you optimistic? Do you feel like, given that, you do experience people coming to you with, at a loss for what to do and with the motivation to make some sort of change, whatever that is, are you optimistic that there can be a course correction?
I am. Yeah, I'm very optimistic. And I know there's some conservatives that are panicking right now. And I would just say stay calm, take a long view, try to understand things from a wider perspective, because, the reality is actually pretty simple. We have a great country. We have a great constitution. We have great rights that have been protected by law and by courts. And this is a kind of fad. This is a moral panic. And you look at history, other societies that had truly totalitarian regimes. You look at the Soviet Union, you look at the old Soviet satellite states where I've traveled extensively. And despite this kind of brutal and kind of surveillance state, police state, gulags, murders, wiping out culture in somewhere like China, the truth and the kind of culture of the people somehow always finds a way to survive. And the challenges that we're facing today are nothing like the challenges that other people around the world faced in the 20th century. That doesn't mean we should be complacent. We should head this off and smash it before it can really take root in our institutions. But, the American way of life will outlive the kind of wokeness epidemic of 2020 and 2021. I'm confident of that.
Chris, where can people find your work?
Find me on Twitter at RealChrisRufo. You can also sign up at ChristopherRufo.com. That's Christopher, RUFO.com. You can become a small patron. You can sign up for my newsletter and even watch my documentaries for PBS for free.
Hey, well, we encourage everyone, all of our listeners, to go ahead and do that. I think you'll be very, very happy with Chris's work and how it sort of gives you a lens through which to see so much of what's happening in our society right now. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. He's Christopher Rufo, writer, filmmaker, and director of the Discovery Institute's Center on Wealth and Poverty. I'm Emily Jashinsky. We'll be back soon with more.